question is that the address be agreed to, and I call the member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is indeed an honour and privilege to have been re-elected to serve as the member for Shortland for a second time. I'm only the fifth person to serve in this role in the seat's 70-year history. So I'm particularly aware of the special responsibility I have to the people I represent. I sincerely thank my constituents for placing their trust in me for the next 3 years. It has indeed been a privilege to represent them in the National Parliament for the past 3 years, and I'm excited by the opportunity to continue to be their voice. This is my third term in the House, having served my first term in the 44th Parliament as the member for Charlton. I'm as aware today of the awesome responsibility I have as the representative of the people in my electorate as I was on the first day I spoke in this place in 2013. I want to begin with some words of thanks, most importantly to my wife and children for their unwavering love and constant support for me in my job. Each of us in the House is aware of the huge burden our representation has on our families. My family is everything to me, and I want to be the first of my acknowledgements. I also want to acknowledge the rank and file members of the Labor Party who again gave me their confidence to be my party's candidate in Shortland, and thank them and all the many supporters and volunteers who insist in ensuring that Shortland returned a Labor Member of Parliament. Finally, I thank my dedicated staff for their coordination of the campaign and their ongoing support of me and our constituents. I'm also honoured that my Labor colleagues have supported me to be a Shadow Minister, and I thank my friend, the Leader of the Opposition, for giving me the chance to serve as a Shadow Minister for International Development and the Pacific, as well as Shadow Minister Assisting for Climate Change and Shadow Minister Assisting for Defence. These three policy areas are enormously challenging and inexorably linked. Fighting climate change is an issue of international and intergenerational equity, and our closest neighbours in the Pacific deserve our support and leadership. With Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong, I am working to advance our agenda to engage with other nations in the Pacific as part of our efforts to foster and preserve peace, prosperity, stability and security in the region, efforts that are fundamental to Australia's own national security. Australia has a deep interest in contributing to global poverty alleviation, but coalition governments have abandoned our commitment to aid funding and slashed our international development assistance budget by an incredible $11.8 billion in the 6 years that they have been in power. This is a source of international embarrassment for Australia and is indeed at odds with the generous spirit of Australian people. And despite advocating the Pacific step up as a signature foreign policy, this government continues to demonstrate that this step up is cynical window dressing, as it merely funnels $500 million of existing aid funds to the Pacific. This has resulted in withdrawal of aid funding from other parts of the world. For example, Pakistan has been denuded of Australian aid funding, given it is at the heart of the struggle against Islamic extremism. I think this is a very short-sighted and counterproductive move. But despite this so-called Pacific step-up, the Prime Minister has let down our Pacific neighbours by failing to act on climate change, which they have identified as the most important issue they face and one that threatens their very existence. And in fact, Australia signed up to the Bow Declaration last year, where we acknowledged and agreed that climate change was the #1 existential threat to the entire Pacific region, including Australia. Mr Morrison had the opportunity to commit to real action on climate change at the Pacific Island Leaders Forum in August, but he let the Pacific down and he let Australia down when he watered down the Pacific Island Leaders' communique on climate change to remove the word crisis and replace it with reality. Yes, climate change is certainly a reality for people in low-lying Pacific Islands, but it's also a crisis for which this government has no plan. We saw the Prime Minister's arrogant attitude to the people of the Pacific repeated in the words of his deputy not long after. In a leaked video, the Deputy Prime Minister said the Pacific Islands would survive climate change because their workers could come to Australia to pick our fruit. It's a disgraceful comment, and the ramifications of that remark were felt widely across the Pacific, further damaging our reputation and our credibility with our important neighbours. In fact, I was talking to a key stakeholder group and one particular individual who just come back from Fiji, and his taxi driver on the way to the airport actually raised Deputy Prime Minister's remarks with him directly. This is permeating all through the Pacific. The government has also undermined the Pacific Labour Scheme, which was designed to bring Pacific workers to Australia to help fill worker shortages here, as well as provide an economic and skills boost to Pacific countries, when at the same time it loosened the controls around the backpacker visa. Instead of attracting 2,000 workers in the first year, the Pacific Labour Scheme attracted only 200, meaning $8 million worth of wages that would have been repatriated to Pacific nations did not occur. And this is because the Foreign Minister was clearly rolled in Cabinet by the Nationals, who were trying to loosen the backpacker visa to introduce an agricultural visa by the back door. This is undermining the Pacific Labour Scheme, and that's having a really negative impact in the region. Just this month, the Morrison government has shown its mean spirit towards some of the world's poorest, with its disappointingly modest contribution to the 6th Pledging Conference for the Global Fund to fight TB, AIDS and malaria. While Australia pledged $242 million, it fell well short of the 15 to 20% increase from other developed countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada and France. And it should be noted the government has only contributed half of the $220 million it pledged to the Global Fund 2017 to 19 round so far, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that, Mr Deputy Speaker. In the area of defence, it's a pleasure to return to a policy area I'm familiar with, having worked as Principal Policy Advisor to the former member for Charlton, Greg Conroy, when he was Minister for Defence Personnel, Material and Science in the Rudd-Gillard Labor governments. During this time, I had the honour of contributing to Labor's defence industry policy, the establishment of the Projects of Concern process and the Mortimer procurement reforms, which were the most substantial reforms to defence procurement in a generation. Yet under this government and with the revolving door of defence ministers, we are seeing more than a dozen critical Australian Defence Force capability acquisition projects running years behind schedule. These scheduled blowouts across multi-billion-dollar projects could have a real impact on the ground for Defence Force personnel. The delays have been worsening this year, indicating the government is failing to manage defence capability acquisition projects effectively. In the 3 months between December 2018 and 19, the government allowed 6 defence projects worth more than $6 billion to be delayed cumulatively nearly 10 years. That is a 10-year delay in only 3 months of project administration. In total, 14 major defence capability acquisition projects worth nearly $15 billion are now running late by a cumulative total of 310 months or 25 years. The revolving door of defence ministers under this Liberal government is clearly contributing to project blowouts. In the 6 years since the Liberals came to office, defence ministers have only conducted 3 Project of Concern summits, despite defence policy stating that a ministerial summit should be held every 6 months. And in fact, news only this week coming out of the Defence Annual Report, we've seen a $570 million blowout in the Defence Sustainment budget in only 1 year, and it's clearly related to the fact that project delays are leading to the ADF being forced to run existing equipment longer and harder than they planned for. We also saw a $3.7 billion typo in the defence budget, where they had part of the future submarine project in the wrong column. That's a very significant typo, Mr Deputy Speaker, and yet again reinforces the fact that this government simply cannot be trusted to administer such an important portfolio as defence. And in Parliament last month, the Minister for Defence Industry, Melissa Price, said, "As the Minister for Defence Industry, my priorities are clear. Defence capability is built on time, on budget and on spec." She's clearly failing the test set by herself. On the issue of climate change, Mr Deputy Speaker, I continue to work with the Shadow Minister and Member for Hindmarsh in this important policy area, and this week I seconded his private member's motion calling on this government to declare a climate emergency. This is not empty tokenism or alarmist politics, as those on the other side might suggest. Climate change is a significant threat to our economy, our natural environment, our farming communities and our national security. Australia's emissions have been rising every year under this government and are projected to continue to rise. Australia must take serious action to meet our commitments under the Paris Treaty, and yet all this government is interested in is fudging the numbers, using dodgy accounting tricks with our Kyoto carryover credits to make it appear we are actually doing something. Well, the Australian people know better. The thousands, in fact hundreds of thousands who marched...
A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable the honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent division. Federation Chamber is now resumed. I give the call to the member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And as I was saying, Climate change is a significant threat to our economy, our natural environment, our farming communities and our national security. Australia's emissions have been rising every year under this government and are projected to continue to rise. Australia must take serious action to meet our commitments under the Paris Treaty, yet all this government is interested in is fudging the numbers. Well, the Australian people know better. The hundreds of thousands who have marched and signed petitions know better. But this government maintains its inadequate target, a target that, despite its inadequacy, they still won't reach. Speaker, combating climate change is one of the great challenges of our time, but it's also one of the most important, and I will continue to call on the Morrison government to take stronger action on climate change. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to update the House on issues that my constituents come to me for assistance with. Unfortunately, many of them have not changed over the past 6 years I've been a representative in this place. At the top of the list are Centrelink, telephone scams, the NDIS and aged care. Unfortunately, one of the main complaints I still continue to receive from constituents relates to Centrelink, and particularly waiting times, both waiting endlessly on hold on the phone to speak to someone and also waiting for applications to be processed. It's no wonder the government has changed the title of the minister responsible for Centrelink from Minister for Human Services to Minister for Government Services, because the people I represent who rely on Centrelink certainly wouldn't identify humanity as being an objective they use to describe their experiences with Centrelink. And this is not a criticism of the professional, hard-working staff who are employed at Centrelink. My criticism is aimed directly at the government for slashing and burning this vital public service. One of my constituents waited over 180 days for her application for the pension to be processed. This should be taken in the context of the average application taking 49 days to be approved, which in itself is absolutely appalling.
Order. A division again has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. Proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent division. Federation Chamber is now resumed. I give the call to the member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And as I was discussing, one of my constituents had their pension application take over 6 months, which is over 3 times as long as it should take. This is, of course, not surprising from a Prime Minister who's told senior Australians who have worked all their lives, paid their taxes and played by the rules that they should not rely on the age pension because it is a welfare entitlement. What disgusting contempt from the man who holds the highest office in the land. Judy, who had to wait the 180 days for her pension, had to stop working because of illness when she was 60. And while she was waiting for the pension to be processed, she had to use nearly all of her bank savings. Judy said it shouldn't be this hard for people who are honest and worked all their lives, and I agree with her. And it's not just elderly Australians that this government treats with such contempt. Another constituent waited over 200 days to have his youth allowance application processed. He applied in January this year and the application wasn't processed until August, well into semester 2 of the university year. The government has also shown its disregard for people on New Start, who are also left waiting and are forced to use their meagre savings before they can access the payment. And despite a chorus of calls from many segments of our society, including, ironically, former Prime Minister Howard and the member for New England, the government will not raise the New Start allowance, despite it being a lowly $40 a day. I'm yet to hear anyone credibly say that they can survive on $40 a day, let alone equip themselves with everything needed to find work. Another major issue in my office is telephone scams. More than 1 in 5 people I represent are over the age of 65, and in this age group, which is particularly vulnerable to scams and who are harassed the most by them. These are tangible ways the government could be acting on this increasing problem, and yet they continue to drag their heels on what is a daily nuisance for many of my constituents. I note that the Communications Minister has very recently issued a formal directive to the Australian Communications and Media Authority that from April next year, all telecommunications companies must use a 2-factor authentication process when transferring mobile phone numbers from one provider to another, and that is a welcome decision. But considering Telstra, Optus and Vodafone already use this authentication process, this directive is a drop in the ocean compared to what is needed to combat telephone scams in this country. Around the world, governments are trying out different systems and technologies to stop the scammers. And certainly in the United States, the United Kingdom and New Zealand, tackling scammers is a priority. But in Australia, we're still waiting for a report from ACMA as part of the scam technology project it has led since 2017. This report must be delivered 2 years after it was initiated and must lay out a plan to deliver real protections and noticeable improvements for the elderly and vulnerable people who are being harassed in their homes every day. Speaker, the NDIS is another issue on which my office is regularly asked for help. I am proud to be a representative of the Hunter and Central Coast regions, and the Hunter was one of the trial sites for the NDIS, and so my constituents who participate in the NDIS have been involved in the system for 6 years now. Feedback I too often receive is that one of the fundamental flaws of the scheme is that it too much relies on the advocacy skills of a participant or their family to navigate the system and address issues when they arise. This should not be the case. The NDIS is helping some of the most vulnerable Australians, and participants should not have to rely on family and friends or the office of their Member of Parliament when they face a hurdle with their plan. The scheme should be much more streamlined and user-friendly. It is shameful that the government has underspent on the NDIS to the tune of $1.6 billion and then tried to hide behind the excuse that the scheme is demand-driven. They are stomping down on the demand through their cuts and mismanagement, and it's shameful that they have not fully staffed the National Disability Insurance Agency. By their own actions this month, the Liberals finally admitted the rigid staffing cap they imposed on the NDIA in 2014 has been hurting people living with disability and depriving them of much-needed goods and services. While Labor welcomes the lifting of the cap by 800 employees to 4,000, this is still a long way short. The NDIA originally estimated staffing levels would be 10,595 by 2018-19, more than double what has actually been achieved. And to add insult to injury, the bill to the taxpayers for consultants and contractors has ballooned from $70 million in 2016 to $430 million in 2018. All MPs know that people seeking help under the NDIS wait too long for their plan, too long for reviews and too long to access support. They find the agency and the online portal very difficult to negotiate. They find it hard to understand why their plans are cut and impossible to find a person to talk to. Once again, it should not be this hard. The government should fully fund the scheme, fully staff the agency and deliver people the support they have been promised and supports they need. Sadly, when the mission of the NDIS moved covertly from choice and control of the participant to what is deemed reasonable and necessary by the planner, a fundamental change occurred in the NDIS that has been very detrimental. The NDIS is a contract. It is about who we are as a people. Australians are fundamentally decent and generous and believe that people living with disability should live their best lives. It's not good enough that they struggle as they do. Another issue that is raised frequently by my constituents is access to aged care, in particular home care packages. Some of the stories of neglect and abuse in residential aged care emerging from the Royal Commission are truly shocking. And it's just as alarming to realise that 120,000 older Australians are waiting for care at home, some up to 2 years, and that 16,000 have very sadly died while waiting for these home care packages. I've written to the Royal Commissioners asking them to hold a hearing in the Hunter regarding the Royal Commission. A hearing in the Hunter would service the large population base of Newcastle, the Hunter Valley, Lake Macquarie and Port Stephens, and allow relatively easy access for those on the Central Coast and Mid-North Coast, all of which have large aged and retirement populations. Our older Australians deserve quality care. They must be treated with dignity and the concerns of their families and loved ones taken seriously. Deputy Speaker, it seems that older Australians are the unfortunate target of many of this government's failings. Those who have managed to put away some meagre savings for retirement are punished by a government which refuses to lower the Centrelink deeming rate, even as the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates and then cuts them again. Deputy Speaker, I want to finally talk about the economy because it is also an issue that my constituents raise with me. Economic growth is at the slowest since the global financial crisis, wages are stagnant, almost 2 million Australians are looking for work or more work. Productivity is going backwards and living standards are going backwards. Collapsing confidence and weak growth are the economic consequences of a government with no plan. This government could raise Newstart because we know that recipients of Newstart would inject the money into the economy. And this government could bring forward infrastructure spending as suggested by the Reserve Bank, by Labor and by many other voices in the community. Unfortunately, in contrast, in 5 budgets, the Morrison government has underspent on infrastructure by more than $5 billion. They like to talk up the infrastructure plan, but it's often a never-never. So, Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, Australians are doing it tough, and this government has no plan. It will not even acknowledge there is a problem, nor even debate it in a House. It has no plan to deal with low wages and rising prices. The cost of essentials are skyrocketing, electricity prices are increasing, the cost of childcare has become unaffordable under the Liberals. Australians are worried about the economy, but Scott Morrison and the Liberals are pretending there is no problem. Labor will continue to hold the government to account on important matters like the economy and their failure on climate change. The people of Australia expect no less from Labor, and the people of Shortland expect no less from me as their representative. So in conclusion, I finish where I began, to acknowledge that I'm honoured and privileged to be the fourth representative of the people of Shortland, following in the footsteps of Charlie Griffiths, Peter Morris and Jill Hall, and following the footsteps of Greg Conroy in Charlton. It is an honour and privilege that I'm forever grateful for, and I recommit myself to the service of the people of Shortland, Lake Macquarie and the Central Coast.
I thank the member for Shortland.